I'm delighted to welcome Pieter Cleppe, who is the head of the Brussels office of Open Europe, and he will deliver his keynote address, and then he will stay on stage for the first panel. Pieter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. So I'm with Open Europe, which is a British think tank. Has always been working to reform the EU, and indeed thank you very much for inviting me here at this great conference. Now the EU is possibly the greatest project of opening up trade in history. Its strategy has been to promote peace by opening markets. If goods do not cross borders, then armies will. So let's make sure that goods cross borders. This was not just a success during the decades after World War II. The Eastern expansion and the prospect of accession helped to prevent civil wars like in Yugoslavia. Despite obvious problems, and thanks to NATO as well, of course, Central Europe is now growing at the fastest rate in 9 years. Romania, even with 8.6%. Still, to what extent do young people still relate to all of this? There are a rumored 1 million Erasmus babies, so you could argue these have their lives to thank to the EU. There are many more born out of mixed marriages resulting from the opportunity to travel, work and live across borders. Young people, that's those aged between 18 and 34, according to a poll, stand more favorably towards the EU than people aged 50 and older. Still, the percentage of the young having a favorable view of the European Union only ranges between 55 and 62% in founding member states such as Italy, France, Germany and the Netherlands. So real passion seems to be lacking. Support is similar in Sweden and Spain, but higher in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, if the EU is such a great success, why did the UK decide to leave? And why seem the governments of Poland and Hungary to be on a constant clash with Brussels? And why have Eurosceptic parties done well in virtually every single Western European country? If you love your children, I think you should correct them when you see them going the wrong way. And that's also the case with the European Union. Let's have a closer look at the legitimate crisis of the EU in Britain and in both new and old Europe. To learn what went wrong in Britain, it's important to listen to the other side. Let me quote John Redwood. He's a veteran British Eurosceptic member of Parliament. He has said the following: over the years, what appeared to be a modest measure to form a common market has transformed itself into a mighty set of treaties and become, through endless amendment and new treaty provision, a very large and complex legal machine that is the true sovereign of our country. This feeling of a project having developed in a different direction that Mr. Redwood just described, in a different direction than it had been sold previously, is quite widespread in Britain. Regarding the tension between Brussels and Central and Eastern Europe, this dispute really escalated when the EU imposed mandatory relocation of refugees. I think if a consultant were to recommend to the Commission how to become more unpopular over there, the advice would probably have been to do just that, to force these countries to welcome asylum seekers. It's already hard for national politicians to convince their population, I think in every country in the world, to be generous to asylum seekers. So you can't really blame the EU for struggling to do this. But then why did the EU decide this? France, at a meeting of interior ministers, warned Germany not to do it until 2 weeks before it was decided. But Germany insisted on mandatory relocation of refugees anyway, and France went along. What followed was a Eurosceptic backlash, with the Hungarian government thankfully using the opportunity to hold a populist referendum on whether the EU should impose migrant quotas. A lot of capital has been spent to anchor these countries in the West, has been put at risk. And for what? Telling people where to live is challenging anyway within the passport-free Schengen zone. Only 35 out of the 160 Christian Syrians who were given asylum in Poland in 2015 were still in the country 1 year later. Most of the refugees relocated to Latvia have already left. It's clearly a good idea to wish for asylum seekers not to be concentrated in one place, of course, but in the borderless Schengen area, this seems like an uphill task. And naturally, we should not give up Schengen. Very important. Luckily, the European Union decided in September to move to a system on a non-mandatory basis, but I think some damage has been done. In Western Europe, the EU had already been facing anti-EU sentiments before the euro crisis emerged in 2010. There was Denmark voting against the Maastricht Treaty and France almost rejecting it in the 90s. In 2005, as you all know, France and the Netherlands voted against the European Constitution. It was repackaged as the Lisbon Treaty to avoid referendums. That is, according to Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the former chairman of the European Convention, which drafted that constitution. Ireland voted against both the treaties of Nice in 2001 and the Lisbon Treaty in 2008. Twice it was asked to vote again. These treaties all had in common that they amounted to transfers of powers to the EU policy level, either in the form of scrapping vetoes or by creating ever more EU institutions. How can it not have had any effect on the EU's legitimacy when popular votes against these projects were countered? This wasn't, of course, helped by the fact that politics remains national and that national politicians have always been eager to blame the European Union for everything it did and everything it did not do. When people don't agree with something at the national level, they typically will not accuse the national level of governance of lacking the legitimacy to take a certain measure. At the EU level, that often happens. People that don't like a certain tax imposed by the Dutch government would simply say this is a bad policy. If there was a German-Dutch government and it imposed the exact same tax, many Dutch would say the problem isn't just the policy, but the legitimacy of such a German-Dutch government. Whereas Dutch people typically would not find it unfair to have been outvoted by their national compatriots, many would find it unfair to have been outvoted by Germany. Yet, national governments, because they are in the driving seat, have been trying to push more and more political decision-making to the EU level. One can't accuse the European Parliament of being unable to mend this so-called democratic deficit, because also there, the so-called Dutch demos would be outvoted. Now that level of disconnect was all reinforced by the euro crisis from 2010 on, which boosted the popularity of all kinds of Eurosceptic populists in elections. How did the euro end up in a crisis then, and how did it boost Eurosceptics? What happened with the creation of the common currency is that banks no longer had to obtain funding from their national central bank, but could now, in many cases, obtain much cheaper funding from the ECB. That easy money was not a blessing. It led to unsustainable public investment, most notoriously in Greece, but also to unsustainable private investment, for example, in the Spanish and Irish real estate sectors. And those two countries had actually been more or less respecting the EU budget deficit rules. When the bubbles had busted, to save the euro, politicians decided to organize bailouts. That created a lot of animosity, propelling European politics to the front pages of newspapers, all over the world actually, and not in a positive way. Those having to pay for the bailouts were not happy, and neither were those having to accept the conditions linked to the transfers, sometimes even in the form of so-called troikas, teams of foreign officials sent to supervise national policy. No governing politician really ever promised this on the campaign trail, but it happened anyway. the euro seems to drive a dynamic towards transfers and more centralization of power. But dangerously, this then fuels a certain anger, translating into electoral success for Eurosceptic populists from both the left and the right. Some of them are not merely against the euro, but they have used the euro crisis to rail against the EU itself. Now, even if the euro would endanger the EU, nobody has really come up with a convincing plan to unwind the common currency in an orderly manner. And this is also why populists, like, for example, Marine Le Pen, are dropping opposition to the euro as they get closer to power. Now, what do these Western European Eurosceptic voters, the Brexit voters, and authoritarian populists in Poland and Hungary have in common? In my view, whether they're coming from the left and they complain about having to follow certain economic or budgetary policies, or from the right and they don't want the EU to organize transfers or determine asylum policy, I think the common thread is that they are all concerned about losing control. This was also the slogan of the Brexiteer movement, taking back control, to capture both the left and the right. Now, so to provide solutions and looking at how the European Union can be made more popular again, we must take this concern of losing control serious. But we must also look at what young people find important. A survey by the Brussels-based think tank Think Young found that what young people regard as the most significant achievements of the EU are peace and stability in Europe and the right of EU citizens to travel, to live or study in another member state. The Erasmus program is a precious tool towards the creation of a new reality for the younger generations. It truly combines the educational dimension with other formative aspects of life. The late Italian writer Umberto Eco has suggested that the Erasmus ID should be compulsory, not just for students, but also for taxi drivers, plumbers, and other workers. Well, I think it looks like Ryanair, founded by the rather Eurosceptic businessman Michael O'Leary, has made just that possible, exploiting the opportunities provided by the EU's single market. It's no surprise that young people are not willing to give up the opportunities created by the EU. They have get used to the ability to travel, work, study and live abroad. As opposed to many older people, they cannot even imagine how life would be like otherwise. Imagine if somebody would propose to reinstate a monopoly for the national airline carrier, effectively banning Ryanair. That wouldn't go down too well with young people, to put it mildly. And the Brexit vote has demonstrated this. 73% of Britons under 24 voted Remain, 62% of those between 25 and 34, and also 52% of those between 35 and 44 wanted to stay in the European Union. They only did not turn up in sufficient numbers to win. Now, apart from the fact that young people support the achievements of the EU, they also are getting used to the benefits of disruption provided by technology. Airbnb, Uber, and BlaBlaCar offer cheaper alternatives to traditional service providers in tourism and transport. Surely regulations need to be adapted, but a full ban would be fiercely opposed by the younger part of the population who love to exploit these opportunities. It is very telling that the only truly major anti-government demonstration in Hungary in the last few years took place when the government wanted to tax internet data traffic. Tens of thousands of youngsters protested on the streets, which provoked a very rare result. The Hungarian government backtracked. Here, I think the European Union has a great advantage, simply because it will find the younger generation on its side when it fights to conserve its achievements and when it proposes further opening of barriers to trade, which inevitably means disruption. Disruption is typically good for the outsiders, and it often disturbs the cozy position of the insiders. Young people typically are outsiders, both economically and politically. There is so much the European Union can still do to develop its core business, which is working to scrap barriers to trade and barriers in our everyday lives. It's good to see the EU making a new push to agree trade deals with non-EU countries, like, for example, with Australia. But what about opening up trade within the EU? Why has the insurance market not been properly opened up? People spend quite a bit of money on this, so more competition could make insurance cheaper. Why has there, in some countries, for example, Bulgaria, not been more progress to liberalize the energy sector? This country receives a lot of EU funds, so the EU has leverage there. Some vested interests also seem to manage to stop progress all the time in opening up railways, postal and telecoms services. I think in the age of e-commerce, we can less and less afford this. To be fair to the EU, it's often the member states blocking this. But has the EU sufficiently prioritized this? Hasn't the focus in the last 20 years been more on institutional navel-gazing and increasing the EU's powers and responsibilities? It's all fair to pursue that, but is it the right time to do when the fundamentals of the European Union may be under siege? The EU is losing political capital by sometimes focusing on the wrong things. When a member has just decided to leave the club because it thinks the club management has deviated from the core business of the club, opening up barriers to trade, the answer seems to be, according to some, even more deviation. A Eurozone budget, a finance minister, a European army, European asylum policies, European social policies. Now, regardless of the pros or cons of all that, this is going beyond what the EU was initially meant for. It is clear that there are areas where there is wide divergence of opinion between EU countries. Italy looks differently at Russia than Lithuania. Romania's labour market is different than the one in Denmark. In my native Belgium, it's already hard to conduct a harmonized labour market policy for the different economic realities. Isn't the EU inviting gridlock when it's focusing on all this? And would vested interests who fear a European Union that finds back its mojo, as it did in the 80s when the single market was decided, not prefer the EU to lose itself in endless debates on grand projects for which there is insufficient common ground? Luckily, the recent establishment of Jean-Claude Juncker's task force on doing less more efficiently is a promising initiative. Also, we've seen enhanced cooperation tried for willing member states to pursue more cooperation on areas that are not the EU's core business, for example, with the financial transaction tax. So those who do not want to participate are respected. That's very good. With Open Europe, we've even suggested that this procedure of enhanced cooperation could be used for the single market to make progress. A coalition of willing countries could agree to open up their services markets to each other. To become more popular, I think the EU should simply focus on what is popular. The EU's core business, opening up trade, is very popular. Most of the time when the EU faces competition, it is because it's organizing fiscal transfer, or because it's imposing conditions linked on these transfers, or because it's sticking its nose into what is possibly the most sensitive topic in every country in the world, immigration. Not when it enables Ryanair or EasyJet to service consumers. Of course, free trade is also suffering from opposition, but even the opponents of, for example, the EU-Canada trade deal, CETA, they did not really complain about the fact that there will be less tariffs. On the contrary, they were more concerned about issues related to sovereignty, such as the fact that their governments would have to respect the judgments of private tribunals, or would no longer be able to set their preferred industry standards. Few have complained how scandalous it was that consumers would now have to pay 0% tariffs on Canadian products, or that they would enjoy more choice, or that Canadian and European companies would now become able to bid for each other government tenders. Well, isn't freedom of movement part of the single market, then unpopular in some quarters? True. But even there, when there is opposition, it's mainly against the fact that migration is not controlled, not against migration in itself. Even 80% of those who voted for Brexit in the UK support skilled migration. The EU treaty offers opportunities for member states to impose some controls, so people feel this is not a chaotic process. And perhaps some more controls should be devised to boost support for freedom of movement in the same way that the European Commission allowing to suspend Schengen in some countries in 2015 may have served to actually save Schengen. Some flexibility will go a long way. In 2021, the EU will get a great opportunity to show it has changed. This because a new EU budget period begins and the EU is about to lose the net payments coming from Britain. In the current 2014-2020 budget, more than 270 billion is spent on direct payments to owners of agricultural land, banks, for example, or the Queen of England, regardless of whether they produce or not. To put that in perspective, that's almost 7 times the amount the Eurozone bailout fund used to bail out the Spanish banking system a few years ago. How can the EU ever be popular with young people if it continues to focus on this instead of, for example, boosting the Erasmus program? Surely, supporting struggling farmers doesn't mean the same as handing out checks to those who happen to own agricultural land. These payments are not going to bankrupt our continent, but with other wasteful spending and the problematic travelling circus of the European Parliament, they inflict great damage to the EU's reputation. I think the EU's core business of opening up trade and administrative barriers is very much in tune with younger generations, so the EU has a great opportunity to reform itself by focusing on where it is good at. It should not waste it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pieter. Lots of food for thought there.